r/NoSleep. I'm lost in a city that forgets itself every full moon. If you're reading this, please believe me. I don't care if it sounds like a joke or a desperate attempt for attention, this is real, and I'm running out of time to explain it. I'm already paranoid that whatever force is holding me here might find a way to stop me from sharing this. So, here's everything. My name is Claire. I'm writing this from an old, crumbling apartment that overlooks a city unlike anything I've ever seen. It's a sprawling mess of architecture from every era imaginable, Victorian mansions squatting next to brutalist skyscrapers, cobblestone streets leading to neon-lit plazas. The air is thick with a strange fog that clings to everything, muffling sound and obscuring the horizon. I've been here for months now, or at least, I think I have. Time is slippery in this place. I'm not even sure how I got here. The last thing I remember clearly is falling asleep in my own bed after a long, exhausting day at work. I woke up in a dusty, antique-filled room that reeked of mildew. My phone was gone. My clothes were replaced with something out of the 1920s, a loose, lacy dress and leather shoes. The first person I met was a man selling newspapers on a corner. His eyes were sunken, his face pale as if he hadn't slept in years. When I asked him where I was, he looked at me like I was the crazy one. "The city," he said, like it was the only one in the world. At first, I thought it was just some kind of elaborate prank. But the more I explored, the more I realized how wrong this place was. People seemed normal enough at a glance, but their actions were off. Some would just stop mid-sentence and stare into space for minutes at a time. Others moved with a nervous, jerky energy, like they were afraid of being caught doing something they shouldn't. The city itself felt alive, doors that were open one moment would be locked the next. Streets twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading me back to the same spots no matter which direction I took. But the worst part came when the moon rose full. I remember that night vividly. The entire city fell silent as the sun dipped below the horizon. People who had been bustling about moments before suddenly froze in place. Then, as the first rays of moonlight touched the rooftops, they all collapsed where they stood, like marionettes with their strings cut. I felt it, too, a wave of exhaustion so overwhelming that I barely made it back to my apartment before I blacked out. When I woke up the next morning, the city was different. The streets had rearranged themselves. The buildings looked older, their walls lined with cracks and creeping vines that hadn't been there before. And the people, none of them remembered anything. Not where they lived, not their names, not even what the city was. They wandered aimlessly, looking for scraps of familiarity in a world that had reset itself overnight. I should have forgotten, too. But for some reason, I didn't. At first, I thought I was lucky. But now I'm not so sure. Being the only one who remembers is isolating. It's like I'm carrying the weight of the city's entire history on my shoulders. Every full moon, I watch it all happen again. People collapse, the city shifts, and the next morning, I'm left to piece together the fragments of what came before. I've tried to escape, but the city won't let me. No matter how far I walk, I always end up back where I started. I've found journals in abandoned buildings written by others like me, people who remembered when they shouldn't have. Their stories are all the same. They tried to leave. They tried to fight. But the city consumed them. The more I learn, the more I realize this place isn't just alive, it's hungry. I've seen things I can't explain. Shadows that move against the light. Faces staring out from behind cracked windows, even though the buildings should be empty. And the fog. It whispers. Late at night, when the streets are quiet, I hear it murmuring in a language I don't understand. I think the city is watching me. Testing me. The last full moon, something changed. For the first time, the people didn't wake up the next morning. They just stayed where they fell, their bodies cold and still. I was the only one left. Now, the city is shifting faster. Buildings crumble and rebuild themselves overnight. Streets vanish, replaced by dead ends and labyrinthine alleys. The fog is thicker, and the whispers are louder. I've started seeing other people, but they're not like the ones who lived here before. They don't talk or blink. They just stand at the edges of the fog, watching me with hollow eyes. I don't know how much longer I can survive here. I found this device in an abandoned library. It doesn't make sense, it shouldn't work, but somehow, it does. Maybe it's the city's way of giving me hope before it takes me, like it did the others. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a way out. If you're reading this, please tell me you've heard of something like this before. Tell me there's a way to escape. I don't want to die here. The moon is rising again. And the exhaustion is already creeping in. I don't know if I'll wake up this time. But if I do, I'll try to write again. Please. Help me. Claire never posted again. But Claire did wake up. It wasn't in the same room she had fallen asleep in. This time, it was in a building she didn't recognize, a decrepit theater, its seats torn and its stage buried under years of dust. The air felt colder, heavier. The whispers in the fog were louder now, pressing against her ears like the droning hum of some distant swarm. Claire's device was still clutched in her hand. She didn't know why she kept it, maybe out of some desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was reading her words. Maybe she needed to believe that help would come. But deep down, she knew no one was coming for her. She was alone. As she stood, she realized something was different. The people, the ones who watched her from the fog, were closer now. She could see their faces clearly, pale and lifeless. Their eyes, black and void of emotion, seemed to pierce through her. They weren't standing idly anymore, they were moving, shuffling closer with slow, deliberate steps. Claire's heart pounded as she stumbled out of the theater. The streets had changed again. Buildings she didn't recognize loomed on either side, their windows broken and their walls smeared with dark, unidentifiable stains. The fog was everywhere, swallowing the ground and the distant skyline. She ran. It didn't matter where. She just needed to get away from the figures. Their footsteps echoed behind her, slow but steady, like they had all the time in the world. Claire turned a corner and found herself in an alleyway lined with warped, crumbling brick walls. There was no way out, but she didn't stop running until she reached the end. Gasping for breath, she pressed herself against the wall, clutching the device like it could somehow protect her. The whispers in the fog grew louder. They weren't incoherent anymore, they were forming words. Stay. Remember. Feed. The figures emerged from the fog, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Claire's breath hitched as they surrounded her, their expressions blank but somehow menacing. She pressed herself harder against the wall, willing it to swallow her whole, to take her anywhere but here. Why me? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. What do you want from me? One of the figures stepped closer. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, its neck cracking with emotion. When it spoke, its voice was a deep, guttural rasp. You remember. You belong to the city now. No. Claire screamed. She bolted, pushing past the figures with a burst of adrenaline. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay there. The city twisted around her as she ran. Streets folded into themselves, buildings stretched and bent like living things. The fog seemed to pulse, its whispers rising to a deafening roar. Claire's legs burned, her lungs ached, but she kept going. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing, a small, circular plaza surrounded by towering, crumbling statues. In the center stood an obelisk, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Claire felt drawn to it, like it was calling to her. She approached the obelisk cautiously, her heart pounding. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden and absolute that it was almost worse than the noise. The symbols on the obelisk flared brighter as her fingers brushed the surface. Images flooded her mind, flashes of the city as it was before, vibrant and alive. People laughing, markets bustling, music playing in the streets. Then came the fall, darkness spreading like a plague, consuming everything it touched. The city wasn't alive. It was dying. And Claire was keeping it alive. She staggered back from the obelisk, the realization hitting her like a blow. The city needed someone to remember, someone to hold its memories so it could reset and survive. It had chosen her. It wouldn't let her go because she was its anchor, its tether to the past. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I'm not doing this. I won't let you keep me here. But the city wasn't going to give her a choice. The fog closed in, the figures reappeared, and the obelisk's light dimmed. Claire felt the exhaustion creeping over her again, but this time, she fought it. She clenched her fists, forcing her eyes to stay open. You can't have me. She screamed, her voice echoing through the plaza. The obelisk pulsed once, its light flaring brilliantly. The figures froze, their movements stuttering like broken machines. The fog hesitated, swirling uncertainly. Claire didn't know what she was doing, but she poured all her willpower into resisting the pull of sleep. The obelisk seemed to respond, its light growing stronger, pushing back the fog. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The city groaned like a wounded animal. And then, it shattered. The fog dissolved, the figures crumbled to dust, and the buildings collapsed in on themselves. Claire fell to her knees, gasping for breath as the world around her disintegrated into a blinding white void. When she opened her eyes again, she was home. She was lying in her own bed, in her own room. Sunlight streamed through the window, birds chirped outside. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from her friend asking if she wanted to grab coffee. It was over. But as Claire got up, a faint whisper echoed in the back of her mind. "Remember?" She froze, her heart racing. But the whisper faded, and the world around her remained solid and real. Claire shook her head, forcing herself to focus on the present. She was home. The nightmare was over. And yet, deep down, she knew the city would always be with her. Watching. Waiting. Because she remembered. And the city never let go of what it claimed.